Thank you for having me here to present testimony today. I come to you today as Chief Research Officer for the Association for Women in Science, a nonprofit based here in DC that supports equitable and inclusive STEM workplaces through research, policy, and practice. I also speak from personal experience as an interdisciplinary scientist who's been the direct target of a variety of forms of harassment throughout her career. I'll start with a couple of definitions here and then share some of my experiences with you. So first, while we often focus solely on what is commonly understood to be sexual harassment, that is unwanted sexual attention, sexual assault, or sexual coercion, behavior that is sexual in nature comprises only a small portion of harassing behaviors. Gender harassment is the most common form of sexual harassment and consists of verbal and nonverbal behaviors that convey hostility, objectification, exclusion, or second-class status based on a person's gender. This is so widespread that it goes unnoticed and often isn't recognized as a form of discrimination or harassment when people experience it. Harassment also is not just based on gender or sex, and for workers who are part of more than one marginalized social group, it often has a multiplicative effect. You'll hear these reflected in my experiences and in the data that I'll share today. As a first-generation low-income college student, in some ways I was fortunate I didn't first experience much harassment and exclusionary behavior in my field until I entered graduate school in computer science in 2003. Walking the halls of my department, 6% of which was comprised of women, students and faculty assumed I was an administrative assistant and regularly asked me where the kitchen was. My classmates and professors gave me quizzical looks in class and asked if I was in the right room. Students told me I was only admitted to the program because of affirmative action, assuming I couldn't qualify for admission on my own merit, and not knowing I had graduated top of my undergraduate class in both math and computer science, while working 2 jobs to pay for college. Teaching assistants offered gendered responses to mistakes I made in assignments. Men who made the same mistakes didn't receive this commentary and were often not docked the points that I was. I witnessed racialized comments targeted at students of color and international students. I overheard homophobic remarks about LGBTQ+ students. I noticed students with visible disabilities were avoided and mocked. I observed how uncomfortable these interactions made not only the targets but bystanders, regardless of social group. I shared office space with an undergraduate who insisted on revealing graphic details about his sex life, despite my repeated protests. As he began to encroach on my physical space, I felt increasingly unsafe and turned to the department for help. Rather than addressing his behavior, they moved me. I attended conferences for women in computing. At one session, a student asked how to handle situations where a respected member of the field engaged in inappropriate behavior. The panel advised wearing wedding bands to discourage the behavior, to pretend to be something that we weren't, and hope that those who crossed established professional boundaries would somehow respect feigned personal ones. These experiences are just a small snapshot from my own career. Through 15 years of research, I've also gathered thousands of stories from STEM professionals around the country and across sectors about the bias, barriers, harassment, and other forms of discrimination they've faced. Every STEM professional in the federal government I've included in my work has had at least one story of sexual harassment experience or other identity-based harassment experience. There's a whole sub-movement, Me Too STEM, because of how common harassment is in these fields, even in the government. The recent National Academies report that was just released found that 58% of women among faculty and staff in universities experience sexual harassment. This is also the same pattern in federal workplaces, as you can see on the slide that I have up on the screen, where between 21 and 69% of women experience gender and sexual harassment. On the next slide, you'll see that in a survey of astronomers and planetary sciences, women of color experience the highest rates of race and gender-based harassment and assault in their STEM workplaces at 28% and 40% respectively. In the next slide, the American Physical Society found that LGBT women gender nonconforming, and transgender physicists experienced harassment and exclusionary behavior at 3, 4, and 5 times the rate of LGBT men, respectively. On slide 5, our AWIS survey research found that 37% of white women with disabilities experienced disability-related stigma, discrimination, and harassment at work. For women of color with disabilities, this was 73%. For LGBTQ women of color with disabilities, it was 100%. Employees who experience or witness harassment face negative health consequences, lowered job satisfaction, lowered field satisfaction, avoidance behaviors, and if they report, they often encounter retaliation and incur financial expenses, as we've heard throughout the discussion today. Organizations suffer too, encountering reduced productivity, increased use of sick and annual leave, unnecessarily lose talented employees and public trust when the culture of harassment goes unaddressed. These costs are even greater in environments like STEM, where harassment is normalized and downplayed, threats of retaliation are at an all-time high, and a lack of trust in the reporting and investigative process produces barriers to reporting and support. While the Commission's work to review policies and programs to address, report, and resolve federal sexual harassment claims is important, equally important are educational and cultural efforts to prevent all forms of harassment, bias, and discrimination. To do this, federal workplaces should address the perceived tolerance and acceptability of harassment by making it clear that harassment of any kind is unacceptable. Federal workplaces should move beyond minimum legal compliance to change the existing culture to one that is inclusive and respectful. They should also improve transparency, efficacy, and accountability in the reporting process and written policies, as well as everyday decision making. They should also gather data